Mark Turner woke up to the same faded ceiling he'd stared at for years, cracked plaster above a cheap twin bed pushed against a wall that needed paint he couldn't afford. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and let out a long breath, pushing aside the creeping fear that today might end like every other day. No better than the one before. But today wasn't just any day. Today he had an interview, not another odd job, but a real chance. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, bare feet hitting cold floorboards as sunlight slipped past dusty blinds. He found his only clean white shirt hanging off the door, ironed the night before with care. His shoes were old but polished until the cracks shone with fresh black wax. Mark looked in the mirror above his sink, practicing a confident smile, the kind of smile that might convince a hiring manager to take a chance on a guy with a patchy work history and no college degree. He rehearsed answers under his breath, strengths, weaknesses, where he saw himself in 5 years. Anywhere but here, he thought, tugging at his wrinkled collar. He packed his battered black folder with resumes he'd printed at the library. Each one represented a version of himself he was trying to sell. Reliable, hard-working, someone who never quit even when things got ugly. He checked the bus schedule again, even though he knew it by heart. He needed every second to line up perfectly. Miss this bus, and he'd miss the train. Miss the train, and he'd miss the chance to finally tell his mom he'd landed a job worth being proud of. He grabbed his keys and slipped out the door. The city was just waking up when Mark stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, shoes tapping out a nervous rhythm as he made his way to the bus stop. Indeed, he sipped cheap gas station coffee, steam mixing with the crisp morning air. He watched delivery trucks lumber past, office workers yawning into their phones. He kept glancing at his watch, heart pounding, palms damp despite the cold. He thought about the company's lobby, all glass and marble, so far from the places he'd spent the last few years lifting boxes and cleaning grease traps for a few bucks an hour. Halfway to the bus stop, he heard a commotion. He almost kept walking. He had to keep walking. But something tugged at him. He saw her then, an older woman in a thick coat, standing by the hood of a battered sedan stalled at the curb. Steam poured from under the hood. She looked completely lost, phone pressed to her ear, eyes darting around at the honking cars swerving to avoid her. Mark's heart sank. He had no time, but he couldn't ignore it either. He took a deep breath and crossed the street. "Ma'am, you need help?" he asked, his voice polite but already tense inside. The woman looked at him, her face softening with relief. "My engine died. I was trying to get to my daughter's. She's having surgery today. I called for help, but they said it'd be over an hour," she said, voice trembling. Mark glanced at his watch. If he stopped now, he'd be late, probably too late. But he couldn't just leave her there, alone and stranded. He nodded, forced a smile. "Pop the hood for me," he said, rolling up his sleeves. The engine bay looked like a mess of cracked hoses and rusted bolts. Mark had picked up a few tricks from side gigs at the local mechanic shop when they'd let him sweep floors and help change tires for gas money. He grabbed the loose battery cable, tightened it, checked the fluid, praying it wasn't worse. He looked at the woman's anxious face and told her it'd be okay. A few more checks, a borrowed jumper cable from a nearby delivery truck, and a quick prayer under his breath. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared back to life. The woman clapped her hands together, tears glistening in her eyes. "Bless you, young man. Please let me pay you," she said, fumbling for her purse. Mark stepped back, shaking his head. "Don't worry about it. Just get to your daughter," he said. She pressed a $20 bill into his hand anyway. He hesitated, but she closed his fingers around it with a grateful squeeze. He watched her drive off, exhaust smoke drifting into the morning air. He looked down the street, saw the bus pulling away from the stop a block away. He ran. He sprinted until his lungs burned, dodging early commuters and jumping puddles from last night's rain. He waved at the bus as it pulled away. Gone. He checked the schedule. The next wouldn't come for 20 minutes, and by then he'd have missed the train downtown. He stared at his reflection in the dark glass of a storefront window, breathing hard. The crisp white shirt was now streaked with oil. His tie was crooked. His hands were black with grease. He looked like exactly what he was, a broke young man trying too hard. Mark didn't want to give up. He checked his phone, pulled up the map, and started walking fast. Maybe he could still make it if he ran the 10 blocks to the train. Each block stretched on forever, but he pushed forward, ignoring the burn in his calves, the cold sweat trickling down his back. He reached the station just as the doors slid shut. He slammed his palm on the glass, but the train pulled away, lights fading into the tunnel. He stood there, bent over, breathing hard, clutching his folder to his chest. A guard asked him if he was okay. Mark nodded, but inside he felt the panic clawing up his throat. He found a bench near the platform, sat down, and stared at his shoes. He thought about his mom, waiting by her phone for the good news. He thought about the months of odd jobs that barely paid rent, the long nights filling out online applications that never called back. He could already hear the polite rejection email. He rested his elbows on his knees, head down, fighting the hopelessness bubbling up behind his tired eyes. He stayed there until the next train came, but by then it didn't matter. He still rode it downtown, clutching his folder like a lifeline. He stood in front of the gleaming glass tower with its spinning doors and polished floors, watching successful people slip inside with crisp suits and shiny shoes. He caught his reflection in the glass, wrinkled shirt, tie askew, grease under his nails. He thought about trying anyway, maybe begging at the front desk for a chance, but he knew they wouldn't listen. One look at him and they'd move on. He stepped inside anyway, taking in the marble floors, the soft hum of conversations echoing off the high ceiling. The receptionist looked up, then down at his wrinkled shirt and battered shoes. He gave his name, voice tight. She frowned politely, typing into her computer. "I'm sorry, sir. Your appointment was nearly an hour ago. Mr. Davidson has already moved on to other meetings," she said, voice smooth, rehearsed. Mark swallowed hard, trying to smile. "Maybe I could just explain," he said, but she was already glancing at the next visitor behind him. He stepped back from the counter, feeling small under the towering lights. He stood in the lobby for a minute, ignoring the curious looks from people in suits who probably made more in a day than he did in a month. He pressed the elevator button anyway, then didn't step inside when the doors slid open. He knew it was pointless. He turned back toward the glass doors, pushed them open, and stepped into the bright, cold afternoon, with his folder still clutched in his hands, like it could save him if he just held on tighter. Mark walked for blocks without looking up, the noise of the city muffled by the rush of thoughts swirling in his head. He knew he'd done the right thing. He couldn't leave that woman stranded, but doing the right thing didn't pay rent. It didn't buy groceries or fix his cracked phone screen. He found a small park bench and sat down, letting the cold metal seep into his bones as he stared at the grey winter sky. He could have called his mum to say something hopeful, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. He wiped a streak of grease off his forehead with the back of his sleeve and forced himself to breathe. He'd find another shot, another interview, another chance to prove that helping a stranger didn't mean he wasn't serious about building a better life. But for now, all he could do was sit and watch the traffic pass by, the hopeful glow of morning replaced by the quiet ache of dreams delayed again. Somewhere inside him, though, the tiny spark of hope refused to die, the hope that maybe, just maybe, his kindness would come back to him. Mark sat on that park bench for what felt like hours, the cold metal biting through his thin jacket until he finally stood and forced himself to keep moving. He walked with no destination, letting the city swallow him whole. He replayed the morning in his head, each detail carving a deeper hole in his. The old car, the woman's trembling hands, the bus pulling away just as he reached it. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd done the right thing. The right thing didn't pay the bills. It didn't fix his life overnight. He stopped at a corner store and spent the $20 the woman had given him on a cheap sandwich and a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm before he even found a place to sit. He ate it on the steps of an old library, watching people pass by. Businessmen with leather briefcases, young interns with pressed suits, couples with bright futures in their eyes. Mark felt invisible, Another ghost drifting through the city, clutching a folder full of dreams that no one seemed to care about. He tossed the sandwich wrapper in a trash can and kept moving. When he got back to his tiny apartment, the afternoon sun had turned to grey dusk. He dropped his keys on the chipped counter and sank into the sagging couch that had been handed down from his uncle years ago. His phone buzzed. It was his mom asking how the interview went. He stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the keyboard. But he couldn't bring himself to type out the truth. Instead, he typed, "It went okay, I'll tell you more later." He turned the phone face down, guilt and exhaustion pressing on his chest. The next few days were a blur of searching and waiting. Mark sent out more resumes, followed up on old applications, knocked on doors that never opened. He thought about what he'd say if someone asked him about the missed interview. Would they understand that he'd chosen to help a stranger? Or would they see it as proof that he wasn't reliable, that he couldn't manage his own time? Each night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of traffic below his window, trying to believe he hadn't ruined his last chance. One rainy morning, he sat at the small table by his window, flipping through job postings on his battered laptop. He heard a knock on the door and froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never really did. He pulled himself up, ran a hand through his hair, and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was a man in a dark overcoat holding an envelope in one hand. Mark's heart thumped in his chest. The man asked for Mark by name, then handed him the envelope with a nod and disappeared down the stairs before Mark could ask anything. He closed the door and stared at the envelope for a moment before he opened it. Inside was a crisp white sheet with an unfamiliar company letterhead. He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the neat lines of text that seemed too surreal to be true. It was an invitation, not just for another interview, but a direct offer to meet the CEO. The letter mentioned the woman he'd helped, describing how she'd spoken about his kindness and selflessness. The company, a big, well-known firm, had been expanding and looking for people with heart, grit, and honesty. Mark read the letter twice, 3 times, just to be sure he wasn't imagining it. He sat back on the couch, letter trembling in his hands. The woman he'd helped was the CEO's sister. She'd told her brother how a complete stranger had given up his chance at a job to help her when no one else would. Mark could hardly believe it. The world had turned upside down because he'd done something decent, something his mother had always taught him to do without expecting anything in return. He felt a laugh bubble up in his chest. The letter gave him a date and time for the meeting. He stood up, heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst right through his ribs. He rushed to his small bathroom mirror, splashed cold water on his face, then sat back down and read the letter again. He thought about what this could mean. A real job, maybe a chance to pay off debts to help his mom, to finally breathe without the constant weight on his shoulders. He clenched the letter in his hands, afraid it might disappear if he let it go. The morning of the meeting, Mark was up before dawn. He ironed his only white shirt again, polished his shoes until they shone, and even borrowed a decent tie from his neighbor downstairs. He practiced answers in his head all over again, but this time something felt different. He wasn't just trying to sell a version of himself. He was showing up as the man who had helped when it would have been easier to walk away. He left his building with the letter tucked safely inside his folder, stepping into the cold morning air with a nervous smile. The company headquarters downtown looked even bigger than the one he'd visited before. Glass walls stretched toward the sky, sleek and modern, bustling with people in tailored suits and polished shoes. But this time Mark didn't feel small. He stood at the revolving doors for a moment, then pushed through, walking straight to the reception desk with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. He gave his name, handed over the letter, and waited as the receptionist picked up the phone to announce him. A few minutes later, a young woman in a crisp blazer arrived to escort him upstairs. The elevator ride felt like it lasted forever. Mark watched the city shrink below him through the mirrored walls, his reflection staring back, tired but determined. The doors opened to a quiet hallway lined with glass offices. The assistant led him to a large corner office with a panoramic view of the city skyline. And inside stood the CEO, a tall man in a tailored suit, grey hair at his temples, warm eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He stepped forward and shook Mark's hand firmly, thanking him for what he'd done that day. They sat and talked for over an hour, not just about the missed interview, but about Mark's life, his jobs, his struggles and his dreams. The CEO listened carefully, nodding, asking questions that showed he cared more about the man sitting across from him than the lines on a resume. Mark told him about his mom, about the cracked ceiling above his bed, about why he hadn't hesitated to help a stranger when he could have walked away. The CEO leaned back, his eyes thoughtful, and finally he said the words that made Mark's throat tighten with disbelief. He offered him the job on the spot. Not just any job, but a position that would give Mark a real chance to grow, to learn, to become something more than just another name in the system. Mark sat there, trying to keep his voice steady as he accepted. The CEO stood, shook his hand again, and told him that what the company needed was people like him, people who did the right thing when no one was watching. Mark left the office that day feeling 10 feet taller than he'd ever felt in his life. When he stepped outside, the city looked different, brighter somehow, warmer, despite the crisp wind that tugged at his shirt. He pulled out his phone and called his mom. This time, he didn't have to fake a smile or twist the truth to make her feel better. He told her everything, every detail, and heard the tears in her voice when she whispered how proud she was of him. He promised her he'd come visit soon, that things were finally changing. He stood there on the busy sidewalk, letting the moment sink deep into his bones. Days turned into weeks as Mark settled into his new job. The office was nothing like the dusty warehouses and noisy kitchens he'd worked in before. He wore a suit every day, learned new skills, and found people who respected him for what he brought, not just what he could do, but who he was. He worked late sometimes, but he didn't mind. Every long night reminded him of that morning when he'd stopped to help a stranger instead of thinking only about himself. He knew he'd do it again in a heartbeat, even if no one ever saw it. Mark never forgot what it felt like to sit on that park bench with nothing but regret and a crumpled folder of dreams. He kept that letter from the CEO tucked inside his desk drawer, a quiet reminder that doing the right thing had changed his life when he'd least expected it. And every now and then, when he saw someone stranded by the side of the road or struggling to carry groceries up the subway steps, he'd stop, offer a hand, and remember that sometimes the good you put into the world really does find its way back home.